All right, we've reached 6 o'clock, so it's time for us to begin our program. On behalf of the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive, the Northern Pacific Historical Association, and virtual railfan, Chehalis, Washington, welcome to tonight's event. A couple of quick housekeeping reminders. Please mute your mic. Please use the chat to submit your questions during the programming, and we will do some live questions and answers at the end of the show. In yesteryear, railroads provided dining facilities for their workers, passengers, and the public at locations where train crews congregated. These restaurants were colloquially known as beaneries. They were open 24/7 at strategically vital locations for food before, during, and after shifts on the railroad. This informal setting provided time for food and folklore, solid meals, and interesting company. In an informal setting, our ancestors ate, talked, swapped tales, lamented the past, and looked forward to their futures. Welcome, everyone, to our 21st century beanery. Using the magic of science, we are traveling back in time tonight to the middle of the 20th century, where railroaders' tales of yesteryear are swapped about at our virtual lunch counter. Our first guest tonight is Jack Christensen, retired Northern Pacific and Burlington Northern engineer. John Henry, Jack Christensen, an Auburn, Washington native, was born June 16, 1926. His father was a boomer machinist who'd come to the NP at Auburn from the Great Northern at Whitefish, Montana. Jack's career began as an engine wiper, a laborer, on June 27, 1942. His youthful start was due to the shortage of able workers due to World War II. Because of this severe shortage of workers, Jack hired on as a fireman on November 1st, 1944, despite awaiting call-up in the Army Air Force, which occurred roughly a month later. Jack returned to engine service after his time in the military and attended the University of Washington by day while switching for the NP at night. Later, he was promoted to engineer in January 1955 and became road foreman of engines at Duluth, Minnesota in October 1965. From there, Jack served the NP at Minneapolis 1967 and Livingston, Montana 1970. He returned to engine service with the BN in Seattle in September 1972. He retired.
There we go.
He retired on July 7th, 1999, with 57 years and 8 days of service, less some of the interruptions we've mentioned. Our second guest tonight is Gary Tarbox, an electrical engineer originally from Anacortes, Washington. Gary is the past president of both the NPRHA and former editor of their magazine, The Main Streeter. After retiring from Microsoft in 2004, Gary saw the need for a railroad archive in the Seattle area. He formulated a plan, gathered founders and volunteers, raised the initial funding, and enjoyed an 11-year journey as PNRA's first executive director. Gary continues to serve PNRA as our first emeritus director. Today, Gary and Jack are going to talk about Jack's memories of driving trains over Stampede Pass on the Northern Pacific. Please join with me in giving a warm welcome to Jack Christensen and Gary Tarbox. Hi, guys. How's it going? Do we have our PowerPoint organized and we're all set to go, do you think?
We are. It was stopped there for a few minutes.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. So,
I couldn't get it.
So sometimes we have some technical difficulties that come up. Okay, one of the things that we could just back up a slide or two quick, Gary.
Yeah.
One more back. There we go. A number of Jack's stories today come from a book of Jack's, Tales of the Northern Pacific. Some, not all. There's other material in Jack's books, and we're working on an update. Jack's working on an update for that book. Thanks. I just wanted to make a mention of that, Gary, and then I just wanted to just quickly share before I turn the program over a map of the area that we're going to be talking about today. We can see on the far left the town of Auburn, Washington, and Auburn to the north goes to the Seattle and to the south goes to Tacoma. east out of Auburn, the Northern Pacific climbs the railroad all the way up through Eagle Gorge to Leicester. And then Leicester is really where Stampede Pass is, where a lot of today's stories are going to be coming from. Working downgrade then from the summit at Martin, we get Easton, Clay Elum, Thorpe, Ellensburg, and then down the Yakima Canyon, finally to Yakima, Washington. So this just gives us an idea of the area that we're talking about. So at this point, I'm looking forward to passing the conversation over to Gary Tarbox and Jack Christensen. Guys, take it away.
We shall. Thank you, Jonathan, for the great introduction. Sorry, I wasn't able to get the advance on the PowerPoint quite like we wanted to, but let's start with the first job you had at the Auburn Roundhouse in 42. Jack?
Yeah, well, the little arrow that points to a platform just to the right of that track, which is the inbound track. This picture was taken from the coal dock, to the top of the coal dock, an aerial view, and you could see another platform to the left of that inbound track. And that was the wash rack, and there was a set of hoses, one for hot water and steam, and one for steam and one for a water mixture with a double spout, double valved spout, and they had a set on each wash rack, and we would blast the accumulated dirt and oil off the running gear, valve gear, and axle bearings, so machinists could work on them if necessary. Then if we had a little time, we'd clean off the jacket a bit, touch it up, make it look good. But during the war, there wasn't much time for that. That was my first job.
So after you did the wash rack, you moved on to the supply shack.
Yeah, they had a supply boy on the day shift only. The night shift, the hostler helpers supplied the engines. And every locomotive had oil cans, a tallow pot for valve oil, engine oiler for engine oil, and 2-gallon supplemental oil cans for each type of oil. There was waste to be put on there, flagging equipment, lanterns, fusees, water glasses, fuse plugs, all the little things that you had to have on a locomotive. There was a little bit of a shack right underneath this. This is the steam plant coal dock. I guess it was only about 8 feet square, but and then that steam plant, just beyond that is a storeroom with a loading dock about truck height. And I have to go up to that storeroom where they had big bins for a base, cotton waste, and big containers to pump oil. So I would have to make sure that there was a supply of engine oilers, tallow pots, 2-gallon oil cans, plenty of waste, lanterns with the kerosene, filled with kerosene, we call it Fortnite, flagging equipment, hot box equipment, everything you needed on a locomotive. And we'd check every engine, which was usually well supplied anyway, to make sure that the required supplies were up to a proper level, and make sure there was adequate supply of these various items, so the hostler helpers on night shift could take care of that business.
So then after that, you moved on to crew caller.
Yeah, Earl McGinnis, he was son of an engineer, Earl McGinnis. He had been working as the afternoon crew caller. We decided to, when high school started in the fall, we decided to split the afternoon shift, so which we did. And I got experience calling crews. They had a bicycle then, and practically everybody had a phone, but if they the union agreement that if somebody wanted us to go get them and call them within a mile of the route, they lived within a mile of the roundhouse, they could ask to be called directly without a phone. But very rarely I had to go out on my bicycle. But that was pretty much for that next winter. We worked as a crew caller, and the following summer we could have moved into other.
You worked out of the little house that's right next to the roundhouse. So
Yeah, that building, we're looking north here. The southern one quarter was the combination roundhouse foreman's and chief crew caller's office. The chief crew caller was Ann Smith, a very dignified lady. It was reported she had hired out when the roundhouse was built in 1915. I'm not sure that was the case. The second one quarter was the engineman's boardroom, connected to the roundhouse crew caller's office with an interior door. And both the crew caller's office and the boardroom had an outside door on what's the left side of the building as we're looking at it. And the boardroom, the north wall was except for a door to the locker room, was a huge blackboard. The top left were switch engines, and the bottom left were extra jobs and locals. And the right side, the top was chain gang, and then at the bottom, any special trains that they had. And the roundhouse foreman, the lower right of that, I can still remember that big blackboard. He could chalk up the numbers of any inbound engines where he wanted the fire dropped rather than saved. In other words, he wanted to do some boiler work maybe. So
then you essentially went into hostler helper and fire cleaner, which ended up using the cinder pit.
Yeah, we go back to this picture from the coal dock. The arrow points to the inbound cinder pit. And the middle track there with the large car, that's the fire car. And you can see the gondola cars for ashes. And the first one's empty and the next one's got ashes. And that cinder pit was shoveled out by contract laborers for the infamous Addison Miller Company. Off to the right of the picture, just to the right, you can see a water spout. And as I said, this was taken from the coal dock. Steam engines coming on the inbound track, the first thing you did was sand them. The sand tower was to the right of this inbound track, the coal dock, of course, to the left. First thing you do is fill the sand dome and top the coal off as much as you could. Then you run it down and fill the tank. In other words, the engine had supplies topped off before it went on the pit. Then when it went on the cinder pit, hostler had instructions to kill the engine by the instructions on the board in the boardroom. We'd drop all of the fire and run the engine in on the remaining steam. Otherwise, we'd shake it down when we had a very thin, hot fire, and it would be run into the roundhouse over the wash rack. And the hostler helper would generally walk ahead of the power to spot the smokestack under the smoke jack in the roundhouse stall. And I might say there's a good shot of what the inbound looked like. And there were times when that inbound stretched almost to the yard office, which is a quarter mile away during the war. 12, 11, we had 3 of these little Y3s at Auburn, 12, 11, 12, 7, 1200. And we had the Y2s that had a little higher drivers. And quite a few of them were equipped with switch engine. You could see a road engine back there, the third engine, the doghouse, probably a W3, could be a Malley, it's hard to tell. But this picture was taken just about, probably from the top of the sand tower. I don't know, it's very close.
Typically used consolidations in the yard because there was a 1% grade in the yard,
Well,
wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't quite 1%. It was every yard of the NP was on a hill for some reason. Seemed like it, except for Stacy Street in Seattle. But yeah, these engines were freight engines, of course, on the mountain, all built in 1902, 1901, and they were some of them. They were all compounds of one kind or another, either mostly tandem compounds. But they were using freight and mountain helper service, but they made very good switch engines where you had a grade in handling long cuts.
So you also had some help while you were there from some Italians, right?
Oh yeah. Well, ordinarily the pit crew was a hostler, a helper, and a fire cleaner. And during the World War II, when things were pretty chaotic, we all had to do everybody's job. I mean, we even got the thrill of moving engines, learning how to open the throttle after you made sure there's plenty of air. And we did get some interned merchant seamen, Italians. Of course, Italy was an enemy, or they were an aggressor, so they would be interned. And I don't know how many they had, and they seemed, they were in their 20s. They seemed older, and they had to observe a curfew. But they could go to town. They had to be back in by 10 or 11. They had a building at the Carmen's lunchroom was made into a dormitory for a small number of guys, and they were quite in demand with the local girls. I get the idea, although they were homesick, they weren't in any big hurry for the war to get over with.
So the roundhouse was in heavy use during the war, of course.
Yeah, here's a view looking west from it's taken from the ceiling of the roof of the new diesel shop was built during World War II. The 7 stalls on the right were generally smaller engines, switch engines. And, you can see the roof has got some dividing walls on the roof. There's 7 stalls on the right, 7 more stalls in the middle, and to the left you can see about 3 stalls. And they were a little longer. That was the Malley house where they put the Z3 Sal Malleys, where they put those, stored them when they were in Auburn. Here's one of our famous Sal Malleys, 4000s, built between 1917 and 1920. Pretty slow, rough riding, but they were the biggest power that would fit through the Stampede Tunnel. They tried the more modern steam engine, there just wasn't enough clearance. They were thinking about a cabin front like the Southern Pacific had when the FT diesels came along, and that was the answer to their prayers. They forgot all about steam, but these were the pride and power from handling freight to Yakima from the time they came in 1913 until the diesels started replacing them during World War II. And you can see that they had a fairly high, although the tenders were very short on the NP. You could see looking at the chutes of that coal dock, when they were down to put coal on, they were almost flat when they got the tank topped off. That picture shows a Z3 headed south, which is not normal. Ordinarily, they all backed out because they had to be headed north to go around the Y and head to Yakima.
So you had a little incident with one of the firemen.
Yeah, well, we had to first have to explain about lap mileage. 1932, they moved the freight and all the division point from Ellensburg to Yakima, right? The depression was really getting serious. And, of course, that track belonged to the Idaho division, and seniority was important on the railroad, and it was territorial. your seniority not only determined what jobs you could hold, the senior man getting his choice, but also what territory you had seniority on. And it was like a legal possession. So what are they going to do? They're taking over 36.7 miles from Ellsburg, Yakima. The switchman had to move to Yakima at Ellsburg. The yard was pretty well reduced, I guess. But when it came to that time, during the Depression, there were only about 3 crews working in Yakima in freight, and then, of course, all the passenger crews. But instead of taking one crew from Idaho, the Idaho division, to bring their seniority over and merge it where it fit into our seniority, both in freight and passenger, that would have satisfied it. And then when they retired, we'd own the job. But for some reason, there were people thought it was going to hurt them what they could hold. So they wanted to keep track of the miles that we worked in Ellsburg, Yakima, both in freight and passenger. And they could bring crews over to work those miles to equalize or get them back on our track. And those guys would never retire. And it ended up during the war, we went to 3 crews. When we had 3 crews in the Depression, we had 13 or 14 crews during the war. And at least 2 of them were Idaho crews. In fact, it was so permanent that the Idaho men just signed over. They could never be bumped. They were old heads from Pasco. And maybe they'd have a 3rd crew that was only there part of the year. And that didn't go over. That was not a very good job. So they had the forcemen over there. And that was our best paying job. Those were our prime jobs. But we had these Pasco men. Anyway, this Pasco crew, there was one of them, the engineer was a little guy, and the fireman was a big, arrogant guy. He was kind of abusive and just throwing his weight around. And he was unhappy with the amount of coal we had. Jim Gersey was the hostler, and he was giving Jim a bad time. And I said, well, back the engine down. I'll take care of putting some coal back on there. So I told the engineer, Shorty, to back her down to the coal dock. And I got up and I started right in front of the doghouse. I filled that till it was running off the sides of the tender. And I had him back it up a few feet, and I filled the middle the same way. And I says, well, Shorty, back her up just a little more. And I could look down over the coal gates. They kind of formed a V under me. I could look right down into the cab. And this big galoot, he's looking up at me, glaring at me. And I opened the chute. He knew what was coming. And I held that chute open, the coal was running down out both gangways and clear down to the fire door. It was about 3 feet deep on the cab. And of course, I shoveled out, the chute was almost flat. I shoveled it out and got off the back of the tank. And of course, I walked back on the fireman's side, naturally. And that would be on this side here. He looked down, he said, what the hell do you think you're doing? I said, well, you wanted more coal, now you got it. Well, he said something to the engineer, and it steamed back up to the roundhouse. Here's this big galoot, he's following our little roundhouse foreman, Charlie Mitchell, a little dried up guy with a big cigar. He's demanding that I shovel that coal out so he could do his work. And I made up my mind it might be my last day on the NP, but I'm damned if I was going to do it. Well, they finally got some new kid, some laborer to shovel the coal out, at least so they could make a start. It was still pretty messy. But you know, we never had any more trouble with that guy. It seems like he always seemed to avoid us from that on. That got that little story in the book. So some things you never forget.
So you then were put on switch engine in the yard as a continuation of working out of the roundhouse.
Well, Eddie Eckes and I, both of us, you know, Ed could do a program like this very easily. his biggest job was the fire builder, but I imagine I figured they used me about 3 times. And I'm sure they used Ed at least that many times when they were just dead short of firemen. They could do that without giving us any seniority or without passing any rules exam, apparently. But they got away with a lot of stuff during the war.
So on Christmas night on 43, you got a chance to actually run the engine for an hour. So
yeah, I caught the job. It was on the night of the 25th. And this is a class lead at the south end of Auburn Yard. Those tracks are angled off to a parallel track next to the main line. And the tracks are relatively short. They made up the north trains. The afternoon crew made up the Everett Turn. The night crew made up 675 and the Woolley Local. The engineer, he was kind of in bad shape from Christmas cheer. He asked me if I'd ever run one of these engines. I said, well, I moved them around the roundhouse, but I've never done any handling any cars. I really didn't know anything about it. Well, he says, I really needed to smell the off. And, well, I don't know the signals. So he got me to stand behind him in the gangway, watch for the signals, twirling in the air and up and down for kick 'em and or go ahead up and down and circular to back up and of course swinging horizontally to stop. And I watched him while he kicked cars and shoved the joints and backed up and after a few minutes said, okay, take it. Well, I was kind of scared, but I gave it a try and it seemed to work. The first time I got a kick sign, I thought he'd never give a stop sign, but the old Y2 that we had, I think it was a 1263 or 68. Well, I only did it for about an hour. Then we went to Beans and I went up to the shack to see if there's any comment. The switchman, if they had noticed anything, they sure didn't say anything. Anyway, that was my first experience of being an engineer. I thought, well, maybe I'd have a career in there.
So then you went off on your first student trip, and the first one you caught happened to start clear down in Tacoma. This is a picture from essentially the Milwaukee overpass, and on the left is the head of Bay Yard, and on the right is the drawbridge line. And what we've got on the arrow there shows a little house, which is called the Cabin Tower.
Yeah.
And
that
didn't last long, but that was where you picked up your train.
Yeah. Well, here we get into this thing about seniority again. It's territorial. Our seniority, the Seattle district was from Seattle to Tacoma, over to Yakima, all the branch lines on the north end and over to Yakima. Tacoma was everything from Tacoma south, all the branch lines to Oakland and South Bend and other places up to Shelton. So the troop trains would come down from Fort Lewis. We changed crews at Cabin Tower. That was the handiest spot because they came down the drawbridge line.
There was a little yard at that point where you could pick up the train, and you had 1763, a Y3.
Yeah, well, when you're hired out as a fireman, you had to make one trip over to Yakima. Of course, mostly steam in those days. One trip north, and you had to make a hand-fired trip. And then they'd supposed to put you in the yard for a month, but they didn't do that with me. They were so hard up during the war. The afternoon roundhouse spoke and said, "I'm going to put you on the extra board right now." But that student trip I made was with that 1763, I believe, with a troop train. from, and I described that trip in my book pretty much in detail.
And this is a picture showing the same area. In fact, just over the last express reefer on there is where the cabin tower was. Of course, it didn't last into beyond the 30s.
Yeah,
So,
but that was still a crew change point, and
yeah. So this is the troop training is 52 at the same location.
right, right.
And then, of course, in 44, the FTs came in, and many helper crews were eliminated on the mountain.
Yeah, I might have been even earlier than 44. I don't recall, but yeah, they were, you know, it seemed like in the steam engine days, they'd buy a new engine, they'd put it in on the St. Paul division, and every division shoved their oldest engine, the poorest shape, would shove them one division west, and they all ended up in the Tacoma division. But this is the first time the Tacoma division got the new engines first, because they really needed to do something with the Stampede Tunnel. The Z6s and 8s came as far as Easton, but from then on they had the Z3s, and it was really it was a great relief to the company to get to the FTs. And
then you got your firing date of November 1, 44, and you picked up a helper for train number 2 out of East Auburn, and this is a representative of that with a Q5 or Q6 with being helped by a Q4. Tell us about what it was like to get out on the road and do the ballet between the engine and the tender.
Well, yeah, as I say, they put me on the extra board. In those days, there was always several sections of number 2, and they practically all of them needed helpers. They had A engines on there, but they all needed helpers. And my first catch was helping first 2 with a 2194, which was a very good steaming Q4. The engineer was Fred Herman, called Fishhead Johnson. And I described it quite a bit in my book, you know, the excitement of getting out, going to the siding at East Auburn, waiting for number 2. And I've got a new chapter in the book on firing a steam engine. When we took off there, you'd have to get your fire with a sort of a horseshoe shape. That is a little bank along the sides and the back where the draft was heaviest on the grates. And you had to have the water down low in the glass. And when you got going, why, you had 1 foot on the engine, 1 foot on the tender, and they're wobbling in different directions. And that foot on the engine had to trip the foot pedal to flop the fire door open while you threw coal in, and you just didn't throw it in, it had to be placed. So you're doing quite a ballet, and every curve you went around, you went around a curve to the left, while it throw you toward the engineer's seat, and it curved to the right, while it put your butt back against the cab wall. And so it was quite a job to get.
How much coal did you throw in that kind of a shift?
Well, the hardest part was up to Canasket, and things eased off a little there. But I figured we'd put it in an hour and 15 minutes. You put about 4 tons of rosin coal through that firebox, and it had to be placed. You know, this could be.
So then you pulled a call, particularly with the 1830, which was notorious as a bad steamer. Tell us about that trip.
Well, I caught that number two's helper 3 times in a row off the extra board, kind of in a rut. The second trip was a 2194 with a different engineer, a fussy little guy, but he was all right. The third trip, I had this 1830, which it had a reputation of being a kind of a hard steamer. And it was a rainy night in Roslyn coal, a lot of fine coal. Duplex stokers tended to plug up. I don't know if you're familiar with duplex stokers, but they had a kind of a Y of elevators on each side of the fire door, and then a portal through the back head into the firebox. And at the top of that elevator is a little hole you could poke out that passage into the firebox if it got plugged up. And the right hand elevator had a tendency more to plug up more on the left. Anyway, it was a rainy night. And, the engineer was Ross to Spain. He's a big bluff guy that kind of a tough customer. He had to have him look at you under his bifocals, you know. But anyway, to make a long story short, we took off. I had everything just right, but that damn elevator plugged up before we got a mile out of town, and of course that engine didn't forgive the lack of coal, and steam started going down. And first thing you know, I was shoveling and raking and sweating. I'd worn coveralls, but I thought, oh, the stoker job, I won't need to have loose overalls. But by the time we got about 10 miles out of town, the steam was going down, and you know, we control the air brakes, and the air compressor won't work on, we get below about 160 or 65, and I think we were down about 20 pounds. But luckily we had a fairly light train for a helper train, and I think the road engineers sensed we were having trouble, because you could feel the exhaust of that A engine getting a little harder. And get to Canasket, the engineer hollers, "There's a message there, get that message." I stuck my hand out, and this message says that ordinarily all our helper engines were cut off at Leicester, and they'd put a mountain helper on. And the message said, "The count short of power will use engine 1830 with mountain helper crew from Leicester to Martin." In other words, have it ready to go. Well, the fire was, by that time, was clinkered and in terrible shape. We were barely, luckily, we had, like I say, we had a light train, and we were able to make the time. But instead of cutting our power off and going to the roundhouse, we had to shake the fire down. And the roundhouse foreman, the night foreman at Leicester, was open to firemen for some reason. And this guy, Herbert, he looked at that fire, and he was really unhappy. He says, "You get on the ground and poke out the pans. I got to clean up this mess." And the upshot was that I was kind of lucky, happy to kind of hide my shame in the dark down there, poking out the ash pan. And then I watched some clinkers coming out the gangway that were too thick to go through the grates. And finally they took off, but I start back to the engineer. He's already gone to the depot. And when I finally get there, he's doesn't say anything. He hands me this message that, "Please advise why number 2 delayed 20 minutes without cleaning the fire 1830. I says, I thought, well, this is my last trip. I'm going to get it now. I said, "What did you tell him?" I told that chair-bound SOB that I had a poor steaming engine and wet coal, and the green fireman did his best. Beside that, messages don't clean fires." And that was, I decided maybe I'm going to be around a while longer. Nothing, you know, the war was on. You could get away with practically anything, short of actual homicide.
So you were called off the extra board then to do 1501 at on the Roslyn job. Tell us about that.
Well, those jobs they were 16-hour jobs, and 100 miles of a day's work. 16 hours was 250 miles. 8 hours of time, straight time, 8 hour time and a half. The fireman, when you got 38 days in, you were supposed to be off for miles. And even during the war, they tried to let guys off after they put it in that job. After about 3 weeks, they had a fireman, and they had you had to register your miles when you're tied up on when you filled out your register of tying up. And if your name started with ABC, you started your miles on the 1st of the month, and C, D, and E, F on the 5th, and so forth, right through the alphabet, so people wouldn't all be off at the same time. But I happened to be over there firing the Roslyn branch with Alec Taylor, working long hours, sleeping in a flea bag hotel for $1 a night. And right about, I've been there, I guess, 4 or 5 days, and my dad came over on number 2, and he was banging on the door. He had my orders to report. They'd made a mistake in the orders. Instead of a week to report, I had 24 hours to get over to Fort Lewis. And he says, get your stuff together. We're going home on number 1 in an hour now. And they're sending a man over on number 4 for your job. So then, believe it or not, we just before Christmas, they put us away from our homes, and I was down. I ended up in Keester Field, Mississippi, just about that time. I remember going swimming in the Gulf of Mexico on New Year's Day of '45 at Biloxi, Mississippi.
So when you returned from the service, you went to WSU and studying geology on the GI Bill.
Yeah, if you got a 12 months GI Bill plus a month for every point you had. You got 1 point stateside, 2 points overseas. In fact, I only had 11 points, but I was discharged ahead of the 85 point men because they were shutting down the cadet program. We were at Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm not going to get into the military service, but so I had 12 months plus 11 that I was in service. Had 23 months, which is a little over 2 years of a scholarship at 9 months a year. So I went to Washington State, and I transferred to the UW in the junior year because I was going to run out of GI Bill in about 4 months. And I needed it. I knew I would need money to go to school. And beside that, the company would not give you leave of absence unless you were on GI Bill. So we transferred to the UW and went to work on a midnight goat as a fireman, and got enough money to finish college.
That's great.
Graduated in 50.
So the Z3s, you only really ran the Z3 or fired the Z3s one time from Yakima after you returned from the service.
Yeah, they were our only power from 1913 to the World War. And they were really pretty terrible engines. I guess they moved the freight all right, but I only caught one once. We had practically all diesels when this happened. I caught I think it was a 4008 anyway. It was a dead freight from Yakima, west from Yakima. The engineer was Phil Ogg, a little guy with perpetually smiling and easygoing. And my memory seems like we were in every siding they owned, but I know we were inferior to everything coming against us. And by the time we got to Lester, they had a crew to relieve us. There wasn't enough time to make Auburn on 16 hours. That was my only experience on a Sal Malley.
And then you, on the Cle Elum turn, you would stop for takeout mills at Eagle Gorge Logging.
Yeah, that was one of the last railroad logging camps on the railroad. There was a big logging operation in Leicester, of course. They had a Leicester logger for many years. Yeah, the Cle Elum turn was called generally, I think, for 9 o'clock. Make sure the passengers, westbound passengers were off the railroad. And they always, enough work, Ravensdale, Canasket. We tried to make Eagle Gorge right about noontime because they put on quite a spread, like a full dinner. For the only people there were the people who were either sick or injured. And but even so, they were really trenchermen, even with they had steaks and chops and big bowls of mashed potatoes and veggies. And I remember going there for dinner, and 15 minutes afterwards, I was the last person to leave. And also you could get for 50 cents, you could get a shopping bag of lunch with fruit and pie at the bottom and chips and sandwiches in between, and maybe a hard-boiled egg or two. This particular time, I remember being topped off with 2 deep-fried oysters in tinfoil. I never did like oysters, but they tasted pretty good after 14 hours on duty. We're over at Cabin Creek near Easton switching logs. It was a 16-hour job. It's funny the things you remember, you know.
So Leicester was a really busy place during the wars.
Yeah.
And you, of course, ended up working up to there on a lot of the helper jobs.
Yeah, it was a pretty wild place.
Tell us about Elmer.
Well, the first trip I described in the book of firing number 2, we usually cut our engine off, this helper engines off, and turn them on the roundhouse. If there were several sections of number 2, we'd wait till, and they had helpers, we'd wait till all the helpers got to Leicester, we'd tie them together, and then we'd run light to Auburn with only one crew having to stay awake. But anyway, after we got our engine turned, we'd go over to the depot and see what was going on. And of course, at night was the one place of warmth and light. And there was the operator was Elmer Schweppe. He was kind of lumpy, but not fat, and he always had his mouth wrapped around a fetid cigar or a pipe, and always good for jokes. One of his favorite tricks was to pretend to chew out the dispatcher in the vilest terms, keeping his foot off the transmitter for the telephone, because there's always these loafers hanging around the office. Found it quite amusing. And one time he didn't realize the depot dog was laying on the transmitter pedal, and the dispatcher took it all in, and I think he got a 30-day suspension so he could tune up his repertoire a little bit. But he was quite a character.
Yeah.
He called himself McGee and everybody else the same.
So when you got to the tunnel of Stampede Tunnel, this is actually at Tunnel 4, Stampede Tunnel being Tunnel 3, about a mile separated. They passed up respirators to you, and then you went through the tunnel. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the respirators, they were in a bag. They were rubber. We didn't know how sanitary they were, but we generally would just get a lump of waste and soak it in water, put it up against our face, and going through on a steam engine, a lot of times you'd be getting down on the deck to get away from the heat. The environmentalists would be up in arms nowadays if you tried to do anything like that. I might say a little bit about the diesel while we're at it. In the steam engine days, O'Malley was rated at 1,250 ton on the mountain. So out of Auburn, theoretically, O'Malley, I think they were rated at 2,500 tons from Auburn to Leicester, and W3 at 1,700 tons, and that's about 4250. But the limit with the Valleys was 3,750, because at Leicester they'd take the W3 helper off, they'd put a mountain helper crew in front of the mountain helper in front of the caboose and one behind to go up the mountain. So you'd have three Z3s, each rated at 1,250 tons. Now westbound or eastbound, the helper at the rear of the caboose would shove through the tunnel 4, and as soon as they got into tunnel 3 and the grade flattened out, they'd cut that rear helper on the fly, and he'd back down the new stampede and go in the clear, generally. The second helper ahead of the caboose would go through to Martin. And I don't know how they stopped without radios, but they'd stop so that the train was by the siding, the eastward siding at Martin. The rear helper would back up, cut the caboose off, head into the passing track. They'd roll the caboose down on the train by gravity alongside of the helper engine. They'd wash the caboose on that side, and the train would proceed. The helper would go back to new stampede, couple up with the other helper, and either go to wherever they were wanted. And that was the procedure eastbound, and roughly the same westbound. I thought I'd put that in because it tells just how the steam engines were operated.
Okay, well then you caught 28 days in a row of being up on the mountain in the snow service. Your particular job was to fire the pusher for the spreader, the snow spreader. Tell us about that.
Well, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think it was probably right after getting back from the service. Probably I was released from the service in November 45, probably January 46, and yeah, I caught the pusher on the Jordan spreader, and of course there was a pusher on the rotary plow. The rotary plows were hand fired. I know we were on a W3, and the other was either a W1 or 3, but they'd work together. On the double track, you'd head up with the rotary and scoop out as wide as you could. Generally, the spreader would follow, and like I say, on the eastward, put out the long blade and bank it up against the bank on the high side, on the right side, and blade across as much as you could to the rail of the westward track. And coming back, the rotary plow would plow up the westward track, and the spreader would follow behind with the long blade out on the right, which was the embankment downhill, and push all that snow off. The idea was to get everything right down the top of the rail level, so you'd have a little slack for the next snowstorm.
Yep. And then you spent your nights at the Leicester Hotel, or you spent your sleeping time, I should say. Maybe they weren't always night.
I forget what they call that room up on the top, that triangular room. It had a kind of a nasty nickname, but the fire escapes was a sturdy rope coiled up by each window.
And then you tended to get into beds that were still warm.
I think so. I think they didn't change the seat because we might be working all night. And the section men might be working all day. Yeah, it was fairly primitive, to say the least. And of course, the firemen on the rotary was a miserable job. They were hand fired and a lot of water dripping down. 16-hour days too. And
Yeah.
every time we get ready to go to Auburn, there'd be another snowstorm. Our boss was a little skinny little conductor from Pasco, Tim Collins. He was our train master, but pretty competent guy, and all in all, it was a pretty good operation.
So we then move on to Ellensburg, which was where the crew changes were before 32. But by the time the diesels came along, the engineers tended to change in Ellensburg, but the firemen went on to Yakima.
Well, I mentioned how this lap mileage worked for both freight and passenger. And everybody was going through the Yakima. I think sometime in the 50s, the engineers decided we're going to do away with this lap mileage and passenger. We can't do it in freight, but we can get off at Ellensburg, because that's where the train crews changed. In fact, the Idaho train crews, if I'm not mistaken, came all the way from Spokane. But anyway, I know our train crews changed at Ellensburg. So they decided to change at Ellensburg. So if you're a fireman and passenger, where before you worked with the same engineer all the time, after they made that change, you work with all the engineers, because they had one less engineer.
Yep. Okay, and then you had a little break into Pomona, which was further down near the very end of the Yakima River Canyon. Tell us about that.
Well, if you were, I can't remember the convention, is in the past at Yakima, I made a presentation of this whole comic opera, which it really was. And I'll go over it as quickly as I can. I was working chain gang out of Yakima. We got called right around noon out of Yakima, maybe a little before noon, on an extra west, about 90 cars. Engineer was Louis Stoller. He was a Swiss gentleman with a real accent, longtime city councilman in Auburn, but not a real experienced hoghead. But he was my engineer. Don Gordon was the head brakeman. Bert Peterson, conductor, and Nicky Emsley was the rear brakeman. Anyway, we had a meet with number 6. I'm not sure if it said number 6, take siding, meet up 54 or something at Pomona, or just a straight meet at, number 6 was to take the siding, or 5400 and something whole main track meet number 6 at Pomona, which was the second station out of Yakima. Well, when you get to Pomona, there's 2 sidings. First siding, you get the eastward siding. It's about 3,500 feet. Not a very long siding. And just a few car lengths from that is the east switch of the westward siding. And it's a long one. It's pretty near 5,000 feet. It'll hold 125 cars. The eastward will hold less than 80, but we had 90 cars. Anyway, we're holding the main track at Pomona. Well, we get a yellow block at the east end of the eastward, and we go by that. And on the right-hand side, there's basalt bluffs that are pretty high. You can't see over them. There's several curves there. And here we go. We know number 6 has got to head in for us. But they had a habit of dispatcher of the westward siding was always a little handier to use. Dispatchers had a habit of saying, okay to use it for a westward train, okay to use the westward siding if at Pomona. And there was something about on our subconscious about that, because we passed the west switch of the eastward siding where number 6 was a head in. We come around the curve in the basalt cliffs where we can see down, here's number 6 coming at us on the main line. Well, Louis Stoller, well, of course we panic. He dumps the air, an emergency. We stop. And of course, number 6 stopped. We're still 3 or 4 car lengths apart, but we didn't collide. And right away, the engineer on number 6, he backs up to the, I think this is where we're looking at. We're looking at the west end of the westward siding right here, if I'm not mistaken. It looks like it. Anyway, he backs up and heads in there with his passenger train, lines back, and he goes by, he holds his hand over his mouth. In other words, we're not going to report this, because we had run the meet. We were supposed to stay clear so they could head in on the eastward siding. Anyway, we're all excited about it. And Louis can't seem to get the air back. He finally seems to get it released, and we take off. We've been delayed long enough. And there was a big sweeping curve to the left leaving Pomona. And I always look back to look at the train and see how it looked, but we're all excited about this near collision. Head brakeman, the engineer, and I, and we get going. I think it's over 5 miles up to Rosa Dam. Happen to look back, we don't have 90 cars. We've got 19 cars in emergency with the brakes burning and the brake shoes burn off. So we stop, and Don Gordon runs back, turns the angle cock so we can release the brakes, and we start back to our train. And we're looking over toward the river to see if there's any employees out there. Anybody saw us. We're backing up almost 5 miles. By the time we get back to the train, Bert Peterson and his brakeman, they've walked up. They don't know what the hell's going on. And the radio apparently had gone conked out when we dynamited our train. And all we did was get a knuckle. So we put a knuckle back in, and they told us that the radio had conked out, but they were, fortunately, their caboose had cleared the east switch of the west of this siding, of the westward siding. And they highballed number 6 out. They were long gone, lined back, and they had had time to walk up while we were going up to Rosa and back. And so we took off, and we thought, boy, we're going to be answering for this. And we got to Weimar, no message. We'd been about at least 30 minutes, maybe longer, with this performance. We got to Ellisburg, no message. He met several trains, fulfilled our train orders, got to Auburn. And if the Carmens thought anything about 19 cars with the shoes burnt down to the heads, they never said anything. Nobody ever asked. So,
so then we moved on to Yakima, and you were on a train coming into Yakima, asking which tracks to take.
Yeah, I was firing for Frank Pasola that time. He was a caller during the Depression, pretty sharp guy, pretty sassy too, and pretty quick with a comeback. Anyway, we're on a extra east. You get coming between Pomona and Sealy, you call Yakima Yard to get a track, and it's around 1:30 or so. It's getting, number 1 will be due pretty quick. Anyway, he calls, the Yakima Yard answers, says, well, we're extra 54 so we're coming in to see what are your instructions? And Yakima says, well, down the main line, head in at the middle crossover, down the track such and such, cut Mead Avenue, backtrack so and so. And Frank Pasola, he lets all this soak in. He says, well, what about number 1? How about number 1? There's a long pause. The yardmaster, oh yeah, I forgot about number 1. And I says, well, out here we don't dare forget anything. We were, in other words, heading on the West High Line. We were already set in the air to do that anyway, so we headed in on the West High Line, and by the time we got down the Yakima Yard, number one was steaming in the town. But Frank was good. He had a real short temper in a way, but if you screwed up something, he would never say anything. And he was one of the guys that when they got mandatory retirement in the 60s, he was one of the guys that had to retire at 70, and he was so outraged about it, I think it killed him off. He didn't last very long. Yeah, I think he blew a blood vessel or something, but yeah, he was a crackerjack hog, and he was pretty fast. But there were quite a few engineers that were very unhappy. Of course, that's one thing Reagan did for us. He did away with mandatory retirement, unless you were in Bill Kubler's class, or an airline pilot or a firefighter. Yeah.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for your comments.
Yeah, Jack, that was,
Yeah.
and Gary, that was a very entertaining hour of reminiscences and some interesting stories of Stampede Pass, right?
Well,
I
I
actually have a
hope,
few questions already in the chat box. So
Yeah, we've got some questions too. Let's just roll through the credits quick, and then we'll pass it over to the Q&A. So we want to thank Gary and Jack, of course, and Robert, our chat moderator. Just a note that the photos from today's presentation come from the NPRHA collection at PNRA in Burien, Washington. And Gary, if we could have the next slide.
Yeah.
Jack is working, and Jack will talk about, well, Jack, let's just ask you right now, how are you coming on your second edition of your book, and when do you think people will get a chance to get it?
well, my daughter Ann and a couple of my daughters are working on it, and Gary says they could just produce it as needed. We added one chapter. I haven't looked at it. There were some minor glitches in the original edition, which somebody that really knew something about it would catch. And there was some a couple places where mistakes that anybody would see. So I'm hoping that we'll have it ready pretty soon, and I'll check with them, and I would like to review it one more time to make sure we've got everything. We don't have any boo-boos, you know.
We're hoping it'll be out by Christmas, and it'll be available online at the company store, NPRHA company store.
Yeah, I did add one chapter, which I thought would help on firing steam locomotive, both hand firing and with the different type of stokers we had.
Gary, if we could have the next slide, please.
Sure can.
We want to thank our sponsoring organizations, the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive, the Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association, Virtual Railfan, Virtual Railfan Chehalis, WAA VSA Group, and Virtual Railfan Chehalis Live Rail Camera. And if we could have the next slide. Funding for this program comes from For Culture, a cultural funding agency for King County, Washington, and from viewers like us. You know, as and we want to, at PNRA, we want to thank both For Culture and all of our generous donors for all of their support that makes programming like this possible. And I think we've got one more slide. Yes, thank you for registering. And this is going to end up on our YouTube channel. If you've got any comments or any feedback for us tonight, we would love to hear from you. Please contact us at info@pnraarchive.org. So at this point, I'm going to pass the program over to Robert Scott, who's going to be handling the questions. Thank you.
okay, we have a few questions already in. Thank you, Jack, for a fantastic presentation. The first question comes from Mike. The question is, one of the first photos that shows the coal dock was the full-size freight car used to get the coal up to the coal chute, and did they utilize it with a cable system, or how did they get up the incline?
Well, I'm pretty sure that every place I looked, there was some kind of a cable system. They didn't. I never saw any place where they shoved it up with a locomotive. It was always pulled up, I think, with a cable.
There's a
Okay.
drop bottom gone too, so that it dropped
Yeah.
into the
Yeah,
chute.
yeah, it was fairly simple. I think they could pull 2 or 3 cars up there, but I'm pretty sure it was all cable everywhere we worked. At Cleellum, of course, we didn't have a coal dock. We had an overhead crane. We had a pretty good picture of that, but we didn't show it tonight.
Question number 2 is from Sarah Sutterfield, and it has to do with the Z3 steam engines that were the 2882s, and she's asking if those were articulated steam engines.
Yes, they were. They were articulated and they were a true Malley. That is, they were compound. The forward engine was low pressure, 42-inch diameter pistons, and the high pressure was about 28 or 30 inches. And that, of course, the high pressure, normal operation was the steam was reused in the front engine at low pressure. And they had a simpling valve. We called it the rabbit's foot, where you could put high pressure steam into the low pressure cylinders for a really hard operation, but it was not recommended. It was not used regularly. But they were true Malleys. They were articulated.
Thank you. Joseph, one of our VSAs at Chehalis Rail Camera, asked if we can get your books through Amazon, or are they only available through the company store?
Yeah, they're only available through the company store.
Okay, I placed the link to the company store in the chat. You can utilize that. Oliver Barrett, he understands that the NP used lignite coal over most of the system. And what was the experience using that type of coal versus another style? And why was it so poor performing?
Well, on my student trip to Yakima on this troop train, we started out with rosin coal. Lee Tusky, the late Lee Tusky, he was an engine man and then later a civil engineer, did quite a lot of research on different coal. Roslyn coal was dense and had a lot of petroleum in it. Rosebud was more of a lignite. It was almost gray, and it burned almost as fast as wood. You needed a lot of it. And if you were firing with a stoker on Roslyn, and you ran into Rosebud, you'd have to increase the rate of feed on that stoker to keep up. And Roslyn coal, if you had one ember in the firebox, you could get the fire going again. Rosebud, if you didn't keep a bright fire, it would almost go out on you. Like you come into a station, you're standing around, you had to knock the steam down. And but Rosebud was made, it was cheap coal, they had a lot of it. And all the NP engines designed to burn in it had big fireboxes, big grate areas. Z6s, 7s, and 8s. You look at the grate areas, and that was to burn that Rosebud coal. And the beautiful thing, while rosin coal seemed to make 2 shovels of ash for every shovel you put in, Rosebud coal, you go on a whole division and it wouldn't be an inch deep. Everything went out the stack. So that's the basic differences. There's a lot more. I could go on for hours on this, but
Now, was that the Rosebud coal from Rosebud area in Montana?
yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
So the north end of the Powder River Basin, essentially.
right.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Real quick, can we go back to the photo of the train meet there from the cab perspective? We'll have that on for a next question, but Dennis Bigley would ask you to discuss a bit about the staff system between Stampede and Martin.
Oh, you're talking about the other one.
No, but yeah, we'll start with that one. But we're going to go to that other one after that. So
Yeah, the staff is being set up. If you notice, there's a hoop in the engine or in the fireman or engineer's hand. There's a hoop there, and that is what the staff is inside of for going through the tunnels. You see that?
Yeah, there was a staff machine at Stampede and one at Martin. And they had the staffs were a metal rod, or actually it had machine grooves in it. A picture would be nice, but the machines were designed that you could only have one staff out of the two machines at the same time. And that staff, I'd say it was about 8 inches long. It was like metal tube with grooves in it, about 3/4 of an inch thick. And it was placed in a holder, a kind of rubber holder about the size of a flashlight. And that was taped to the hoop there. You can't really see it there, but it was a rubber holder with a cap on it. That staff was inside. And once you had that staff, you had rights over all trains. And nobody could enter the tunnel section until that staff was put in the machine at Martin. You had to have both machines with a certain number of staffs before you. And there was such a thing as a helper staff that worked for helpers going one way, but that's a separate issue. I hope that explains it in a way. Jimmy Fredrickson has some excellent photographs of the staff machine itself, and I'm not sure about the staff, but it was just a short metal bar about 10 inches long, 8 or 10 inches.
Yeah, we have a copy of the hoop and staff at the archive. So we could actually show that to people if they're interested.
Yeah, one of the few artifacts that we keep.
Go ahead, Robert. I don't hear you.
Sorry about that. Sarah has a follow-up question to that, and then we'll jump back to the other photo. She's heard that the crown sheet as part, let's see, I've heard about a crown sheet as part of the firebox and boiler. Can I know more about that?
Well, the crown sheet is the top of the firebox. And of course, this firebox is fairly thin metal compared to the boiler itself to transfer heat. And you have stay bolts that connect the outside of the boiler shelf to the firebox. The crown sheet is the top of the firebox. And you have to have water above the crown sheet so that the heat from the firebox can be transmitted into steam. Now, if you visualize, I would say that it was about 20 to 24 inches from the top of the boiler to the top of the crown sheet. On the top on the sides, it was about, I would say, roughly 6 inches from the side of the firebox to the side of the boiler. If you can visualize that, it'd be nice we had a diagram of it. But you imagine these stay bolts are about I'd say 4 or 5 inches, because they're holding 200 pounds per square inch of boiler pressure. And that water has to be above that crown sheet. If it gets below it, it would overheat and it would almost fail almost immediately. That was a major cause of boiler explosions.
Yeah.
And when the boiler exploded, it would actually blow the back of the boiler up, and it would pivot around the front of the boiler, and all the flues would probably spread out like spaghetti. But that was the main cause of boiler explosions, was low water. And there were engineers that were known to be low water engineers that were high water. And if you get the water too high, you could slop it through the throttle. And on the older engines, the throttle valve, the superheater units were between the throttle valve and the cylinders. And if you slopped water into through the throttle, it would go into the superheater units and make steam, whether you wanted steam in the cylinders or not.
That's right.
On the later engines, the 8, 4, 3s, 4, 5s, and the A's themselves, they have what they call a front end throttle, where the throttle valve was, it went through steam went through the superheater units before it went to the throttle valve. That's and you can see picture of the engines. You can see the throttle lever going up almost to the back of the smoke box. That's just a little sidebar on that, but the crown sheet was a very delicate part of it because the plating was fairly thin. I would say the boiler shell itself was at least 3/4 or maybe an inch thick, whereas the crown sheet was probably half of that. I hope that explains it. There are diagrams. I know the blueprints. If we showed some locomotive blueprints, you could see the outline of the firebox in dotted lines on those blueprints.
And then back to this photo here that's posted. What happens if you miss the staff or the hoop? Do you have to back up and go get it?
Well, I guess I don't know of anybody losing it, but I guess it could happen now.
But if you miss it, if you miss dark or you weren't there in time or whatever.
Yeah, you had to have the
You couldn't enter you could not enter the tunnel section without the staff in your possession.
Okay, next up we have actually Bill Keebler. If you're still on, can you post the question you have in the chat for the photo of the break apart meet? And we'll get to that here.
It's that picture, Gary, if you can put that back up. It's the one, it's the second to the last slide in the that one right there. Before I ask my question though, I just want to extend my personal thanks to you guys, Gary and everybody, and Jack for all of this work you guys done on this. It's just been fabulous. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Bill.
Jack, my question for you about this picture. Now, I don't have the best computer screen in front of me right now, I admit that, but I'm wondering, is it possible that this photo is at the west switch at Thorpe, the furthest west switch at Thorpe? I know they had 2 sidings there, but does that look right for you, or is this definitely at Pomona?
I would not swear it's at Pomona. We were talking about Pomona, and this is the picture I was given. It's not. You could be right. I think if this was a west switch, there should be more. I don't know, not exactly basalt cliffs there, but there should be higher banks. It does not look in a way like the west switch.
Jimmy marked it as Pomona, so that's my.
Yeah, I know he did. I've seen that. I think I've seen that before, but,
yeah.
But if I remember correctly, and if this is the same photo I studied, this I'm pretty sure it's at Thorpe.
At Thorpe, okay.
Yeah.
I think that would be.
I'll based on your authority, which I respect a lot, I'll remark that as Thorpe in the collection.
Okay.
We've also heard that it might be Sela.
Yeah. All I know is when I'm talking with Bill, I better be telling the truth. I don't dare make up too much there.
Well, that works both ways, Jack. It works both.
Color, that is definitely not Sela.
Oh.
Yeah, it doesn't look right for Sela either. No, that ridge in the background is, at least that's what I think I'm seeing. That looks like Thorpe to me, and the tree pattern and so on. I've seen that before.
I think you're probably right, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Yeah.
Well, we can do some research on it.
We know they had a lap siding at Thorpe.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to continue on here.
Thank you.
John Fuji has a question. Was water quality pretty good or equivalent across in all areas of the areas that you worked on? And then did it ever provide any poor steaming qualities or conditions?
Well, I'd say that we had about ideal water conditions. We had by federal law, you had to wash the boiler once a month. And all of our boiler washers were Japanese gentlemen. They were tough guys. They'd get up there with high pressure hoses, usually in the main shop and all. And wash the boiler was really something. Well, they had to be. we had to have a hydro, I think, once a year. I think on some eastern divisions, I know the Santa Fe, I think they had to wash the boiler every trip. The water was so bad.
Yeah.
But,
Western Washington water is acidic rather than being base. So that, but when you got over into extreme Eastern Washington, you do run into some more base derived water.
You accidentally muted
One more
yourself. There you
here.
go.
Sarah would like to ask if on the crown sheet or on the back of the boiler, were there some plugs that were designed to burn through to put the fire out instead of causing an explosion?
yeah, I think there were fusible plugs. I'm not sure how the NP was equipped, but I know they were a common use, and theoretically they would melt before the explosion occurred. And of course, if they melted, the steam would probably douse the fire, because it'd be steam pressure going right down against the fire bed. But I know that there were explosions caused by low water. It's fairly common.
Okay. And we're going to ask for one more round for any last questions for Jack. We're getting close to our timing. We've had quite a few people still stick around for us. So that is fantastic. I have put a couple links in the chat that refer back to some of the questions we had, looking at the Z3 builder info, and that is right from the PNRA site. So it's linked to there, so you can save it on your favorite device and peruse as you like. Open up for one more round for questions. Again, we're going to close. Appreciate everything. We're going to close the questions down, and I'll turn it back over to Jonathan. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert, I guess the only question that I've got for these guys is when can we get back together and talk about trains again sometime? I think everybody would like to do that, Jack.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why don't we go down on the south end? There's a lot of good stories there too.
Okay. Well, that sounds great.
So
So
look at bringing Jack back, and then also we're looking at Ted potentially from Skycomish about talking about being the fireman on the last W1 electric before they brought the power down in 1956. So we're going to line that out with him. He's very interested in working with this. So we'll get with Bob Kelly to get a good group of Great Northern photos, and we'll get some dates going.
Well, that sounds great. So anyway, I just want to one more time thank our presenters, Gary and Jack, for a wonderful program, for Robert for the moderation of the program, and for PNRA for providing all, the library for all these images to come from, and for all of you for taking the time to take out of your schedule to be able to enjoy this programming. That's really what makes it worthwhile for all of us, is the ability to share it with all of you. So at that point, I'm going to say thank you all very much for attending our program, and stay tuned for the next time that we get together. Good night, everyone.